What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a discussion video about the connections I think that will be made between Baldur's Gate 2 and Baldur's Gate 1 as well, between those earlier games and Baldur's Gate 3. So before we jump into those things, I need to preface this video with a few different things. For starters, spoilers for all of the games. Not so much 3, obviously, but 1 and 2 for sure. And a little bit of 3. Another thing I need to bring up is the fact that Wizards of the Coast, which is the people behind Dungeons & Dragons, have previously stated that the canon for their video games, as well as the canon for their actual tabletop adventures, like the PDFs and the source books they put out, are separate things. You can see a lot of interconnectivity between them, of course, simply because it's all based on the same stuff, simply due to the nature of one being a tabletop game and the freedom that comes with that. I think they felt the need to separate that stuff. So just understand that they are on record for saying that, if need be, they separate those canons. But that certainly doesn't stop us from seeing intermingling between the two, which is why, of course, we see dritz all throughout the series and, in some cases, books and video games, etc. So I want to kick this video off by explaining that if you're unaware, there is a canon ending to the first 2 Baldur's Gate games, actually. More specifically, the second, as the second game is more of a direct sequel to the first game. That takes place basically immediately afterwards, Between Baldur's Gate 2 and Baldur's Gate 3, there is going to be a 100-year gap. Now, that might sound like a lot, but remember that this is a fantasy setting. I would have you know that the canon protagonist, if you will, of the second game actually lived until about 10 years prior to the start of Baldur's Gate 3. So with that in mind, let's talk about what the canon ending for the second game actually is. For our newcomers who might not have played the first 2 games, those games follow the story of Gorian's Ward, or the heroes of Baldur's Gate, in which we see our protagonist come into knowledge that they are in fact Bhaalspawn, which is children of the dead god Bhaal, and those 2 games are largely about the Bhaalspawn saga, if you will. And at the very end, when your champion has defeated all of the challenges before them, they are faced with the choice of either ascending to godhood to become the new Lord of Murder, or declining that power. Now that is where the actual games end. And if you want more specific details than that, I do have a story series for both, which will give you much more detail about the ins and outs, but we're just kind of focusing on that broad picture for this video. Now, the games left it right there. Did our hero choose to ascend to divinity, or carry on with their mortal life, having removed the taint of the Lord of Murder from their blood, thus allowing them to live, in theory, a normal life? This is where our canon ending picks up, of course. Technically, the protagonist from Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 was a man named Abdul Adrian, and the canon choice here at the end is that he declined the power of the gods, and actually went back to Baldur's Gate, where he served the Flaming Fist, and eventually became a Grand Duke of the city, where he lived for another 100 years. He did not die until 1482, which is about 10 years before Baldur's Gate 3 starts. And this is where we can start theorizing some connections. So for starters, how did he die? Because at the time of his death, Abdul was 130 years old, which is very long-lived for a human. This is because of the once immortal power he used to have. Apparently it granted him some longevity past what would be typical of a human being. So, in theory, no one actually knows how long this dude might have lived and then died of old age. But he did not die of old age. He was murdered. He was murdered by what actually turned out to be the last Bhaalspawn left, a man named, I believe it's pronounced Vikang. Vikang is subsequently killed almost immediately after this by a group of adventurers in the source book called Murder in Baldur's Gate. This is a PDF that lays all this out for us, actually tells us about the death of the protagonist from Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. So that's the main thing I want people to know. So let's start drawing some parallels. For starters, the Grand Duke in charge of the Flaming Fist during Baldur's Gate 3, as well as the source book that takes place right before Baldur's Gate 3, Descent into Avernus, Elgar Ravengard. This person directly knew the hero of Baldur's Gate, that is to say Abdul. Elgar Ravengard served as his right-hand man, and after Abdul died a couple years later, Elgar basically took his position as a Grand Duke. So for starters, it is very likely that just right there we will meet someone in that Grand Duke who has very much so came into recent, like a decade ago, contact with the hero from that game, from the previous games, or at least the canon hero from those games. In addition to this, with the hero only dying 10 years prior to the game, it's likely that we will meet, in theory, a lot of other characters that might have knew this person, as well as potentially even companions and things that we traveled with throughout the first 2 games, because some of them are elves and whatnot, and could have easily lived another 100+ years past those games. Now, some other ways this might actually track back to the games are more speculative in nature. Like, that is the most direct connection I can make, is that it will likely connect in a way that is more recent than you think, because the canon protagonist from the second game only died recently in terms of Baldur's Gate 3. However, there are a couple more connections to be made. For starters, throughout the first 2 games, we're trying to prevent the resurrection of the Lord of Murder, Bhaal, the dead god of murder. During the events of Murder of Baldur's Gate, he actually manages to be resurrected, because it turns out Bhaal was actually pulling even more strings once his initial plan of being resurrected failed with Amelason from the second game. It turns out that just the tiniest bit of power was left in Abdul's soul from Bhaal, and Bhaal exploited this to basically give suggestion, if you will, to Abdul, which then led him on this path to eventually being murdered and Bhaal being resurrected, which means the unseen antagonist, Bhaal, if you will, from the first 2 games, is actually alive and kicking, so to speak, in the timeline of Baldur's Gate 3. So we could see some connections made there, as Bhaal is finally free to carry out his plans of continuing his murders as the god of murder. And then lastly, I want to mention one other possible connection that I think is a little more vague in nature, but I do have some information about it. If you're unaware, in Descent into Avernus, which is the source book that leads up to Baldur's Gate 3, it is specifically mentioned that one of the Grand Dukes of Baldur's Gate is struggling with mental control against a mind flayer. Basically, this Grand Duke is indisposed, and the source book tells us that that is because that Grand Duke is slowly fighting off a mind flayer mentally and is losing that battle. So, obvious connection right there to the source book and Baldur's Gate 3, mind you. However, how does that connect back to the previous games? Well, starting in Baldur's Gate 2, we see mind flayers everywhere in that game. They're all over the place. You will see them in the Underdark. You will see them in a hidden enclave under Athkatla and a couple of other places. They come up a lot in Baldur's Gate 2. And while it wasn't part of the original game released a expansion of sorts in 2016 that was made by a separate company, Beamdog, called Siege of Dragonspear. And in Siege of Dragonspear, we can come across the Temple of Bhaal, where the children of Bhaal were meant to be sacrificed to initially resurrect him, though that plan, of course, failed. However, in that temple, we can actually come across a mind flayer who is doing who knows what there. So while I can't draw any specifics about exactly what their plans were or how they connect to Baldur's Gate 3, it is very possible for them to kind of blend in some sort of storyline between what all these damn mind flayers were doing in Baldur's Gate 2, etc., and what their goal was. Because throughout those cutscenes and things that we see them in, they are never working directly for someone, they are furthering their own ends. It's just never actually told to us what they were doing. There's just a lot of them. So in terms of more specific things, I think it would be very easy to tie in what those mind flayers have been doing for the last 100 years, or if we disrupted their plans accidentally in Baldur's Gate 2, and then that led to them, reorganizing over the next 100 years, and then leading into the events with the mind flayers in Baldur's Gate 3, which is a huge part of that story, obviously. So while, of course, again, nothing specific right there, I do want to mention that, again, mind flayers are very much so prevalent in Baldur's Gate 2, and they could definitely weave that into a storyline into 3. There you go, guys. Again, some of this is speculation simply because what is considered sourcebook canon and what is considered video game canon for Wizards of the Coast are separate things that they have stated as such. Again, we see a lot of that intermingling, and Descent into Avernus was marketed as a direct lead-in to Baldur's Gate 3. It sort of set the stage. So how much they adhere to their own rule of how much, what is canon, is definitely up for debate, and more than anything, it seems like an attempt to allow creative freedom in both fields while not technically invalidating anything, if I had to guess. Technically, some of this is speculation, simply because of that rule. But there are all of the in-game and out-of-game things I could find that could potentially fill the 100-year gap or connect the stories of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 to the story of Baldur's Gate 3. Now I'm going to give my opinion for this last part of the video. My opinion is that I am not wild about the canon ending to Baldur's Gate 2, just because of the natures of those games and then kind of all the RPG elements and stuff that went into it. to give it such a strict canon ending was a weird choice. I get why they did it. They were trying to bring D&D forward and everything into the new editions of the game and kind of set the stage for the lore and stuff. And with the story of Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 having such a huge place in the Sword Coast, obviously they needed to nail that down to a specific person. So I get why they did it. I'm just not wild about it. And when it comes to Baldur's Gate 3's story in particular, a lot of people have the criticism that it doesn't even really connect to the first two games and that they're just using the name. In reference to that specifically, I would say, as of right now, I'm on the fence about it. I want to see exactly where this story goes that they're writing, because as I've just mentioned, there are several possible connections to the previous games. I would very much so like to see the story at least tie itself into that saga in some way, or at least involve furthering the plans of Bhaal now that he's resurrected, for instance. I would like to see some kind of tie in there, at least. But there you go, guys. Just kind of a speculative video about the potential plot threads that could be woven between the first two games and 3, which is set 100 years later. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.